Welcome. We're glad that you can join us here. And today we have Dr. John Goetsch with us. He's visiting our church for the very first time. And he's come here for the Godly Living Conference, an annual conference that we have for the people of our church, for the surrounding churches. And we're glad that he's able to make it. And I understand that you are a pastor, an evangelist, and a teacher and vice president of West Coast Baptist College. And we're glad that you can come here. So we're going to have a three-part discussion here. We'll talk about your life, introduce yourself. We've known you for many years as traveling to Lancaster and being there at Spiritual Leadership. And so we're glad you're here.
Thank
and
you.
Share about yourself a little bit, where you grew up, where you're from, how you came to Christ, and maybe your current family situation. So please, Dr. Goetsch.
Sure. My great-grandfather came to this country from Germany. And on the boat, on the way here, a Baptist preacher witnessed him, and he trusted Christ as Savior. And so he settled a farm in Wisconsin. And of course, my grandfather took that farm, and then my dad. And so I grew up on a dairy farm in southern Wisconsin. And we went to church every time the doors were open. So I grew up in a good, godly home. I heard the gospel many times, and when I was 5 years old, my sister, who's 3 years older than me, she had gotten saved, and everybody was happy about that. And I thought, well, I want people to be happy about me. And so I said, I want to be saved. But I didn't really understand what that meant. And
How old were you at that time?
I was 5.
You're
I was
5
years old.
Okay.
And I went to my mom, and she talked to me. I don't remember much about it. And I remember we knelt down and we prayed in the sewing room. And I remember all those details. I even remember the date. It was August 30th, 1957.
Wow.
But I don't remember anything in my heart. And so I grew up sort of wondering at times, would I go to heaven if I died? And being on a farm, you experienced tragedies and you'd hear about neighbors, getting hurt and different things. And each time that would happen, I'd think, what if I were to die? Would I go to heaven? So as a teenager, I went to camp in the summertime. And that's where I heard a clear presentation of the gospel when I was 15. And it was there at camp that I trusted Christ as my Savior. I went back home and got baptized shortly after that. And then was in a public school growing up. We didn't have Christian schools at that time. And so struggled a little bit as a teenager, just the normal wrestling back and forth, but never got into any sin or trouble and those kinds of things. But sports was a big thing for me. And that kind of became the priority in my life. And it became God. And so my senior year in high school, God put me in a hospital for 3 months. And I wasn't able to move at all. I had a virus in my heart area that they couldn't identify at first. And so for 3 months, God was just dealing with me about giving my life to Him. And I knew that. And I didn't want to go out and sin per se, but I wanted to live for me. And so I wasn't willing to surrender. I wanted to go play football and just be happy in some sports career. And so I ran from the Lord for about 1.5 years and just struggled. I was in college, but I couldn't play. And finally, through a coach that was there at the college, and I'd become close to him, and he challenged me to give my life to the Lord. And so I did. I just said, Lord, I'll do whatever you want me to do. And within an hour that I surrendered my life to the Lord, my physical condition was back to normal.
Wow.
And I was able to play 3 years of college football and 4 years of college basketball.
Wow.
And so God honored His word. Seek ye first the kingdom of God and His righteousness, and all these things will be added unto you. So I'm thankful that He used that in my life to lead me in the path that He wanted me to go.
Wow. What's your family now?
I met my wife in college, my freshman year. She was a little bit ahead of me, about 1.5 years. And we kind of became friends. We weren't really serious about getting married. We were very focused on finishing our education. She graduated, went off and taught in a Christian school in Indiana. And so we kind of felt like the Lord was moving us apart. He was calling me to preach and into evangelism, and she was very focused on teaching. And so we kind of broke up for a time, and then we began to realize that God had a pretty neat plan in mind, and that was that we would get married, travel together, and as our family came along, she taught our kids on the road through a Becca homeschool, and we were able to see our kids go through school that way, and I had my own teacher on the road teaching our kids. So it all worked out, but we had 4 children. They all grew up on the road, basically.
Yeah.
And then in 1996, God brought us to Lancaster, where we became part of the team there with the college. The college was just a year old, and we began to work in the college aspect of things, and I continued to travel as I do now on the weekends and as many weeks as I possibly can, along with teaching there at the college.
Wow. So our next part, you mentioned a little bit about your involvement in ministry and how God took a hold of your life and you surrendered to Him. Which ministries are you currently involved in or have been involved in? How many hats have you worn?
Sure.
And then maybe speak a little bit how God, give us more information how God really called you into ministry, because you mentioned that you surrendered, but then you continued to play sports.
Yeah.
And so when that moment where you actually, went into full-time ministry?
Sure. When I came to West Coast, I had been in evangelism full-time for 22 years, just traveling every week in a different church, preaching. And I was perfectly content to do that the rest of my life. I felt that that's what God had called me to do. And I'll go back and kind of circle how that came about. But when Pastor Chappell approached me about the college, I felt like there was a need to invest in the next generation. And I kind of was at that point in my life, I guess, at mid-40s, to say, well, maybe I can influence some younger men to go into the ministry, because I'm not going to last forever. And I think when you're young, you just want to do everything yourself. But then as you get a little bit older, and my kids were coming up into college age, I thought, well, I want to invest, in the next generation. So we came to West Coast, and I did take on a heavy administrative load, as well as a heavy teaching load, which I enjoy. I really do enjoy the classroom, enjoy seeing these young people develop for the Lord. But I'm called to preach, and I'm called to evangelism, and God made that very clear. In college, I was serving a summer internship up in Minneapolis, Minnesota, between my sophomore and junior year, and we took the teenagers up to a camp in Canada, a kind of a work camp, and it was there that God began to deal with me about preaching. I didn't see myself as a preacher. I'm introverted by nature, grew up on a farm, just didn't see myself as somebody on a platform or speaking. And so God had to kind of confirm that over a period of time. I didn't want to say I'm called to preach and then 2 weeks later say, no, maybe not. So I let the Lord kind of saturate my life with that. I kind of felt like when I did surrender to the Lord that maybe He'd put me in a teaching role and coaching, because that's where my interest was. But He did have plans for me to preach. And so then a year later, after I surrendered to preach, God began to work on evangelism. And again, I really didn't see myself doing that. I never traveled outside of the state of Wisconsin until I was in college playing football. My parents never took vacations. We never went anywhere. We had to milk cows every day. And so I never had traveled. I'd never been anywhere. So my thinking wasn't to do that naturally. But when God works in your heart, He changes all of your desires and all of your want-tos to fit His plan. Yeah. And I love traveling. I love being on the road. I enjoy it. And it's been my life now for over 50 years of just traveling. And when I first went to West Coast, Pastor said, I kind of want you to stay a little closer to home and really get involved in the college. And after a year, I was miserable. And I said, Pastor, if I don't go to a truck stop and sleep in the backseat of my car pretty soon, I'm going to go crazy. And so he saw that, of course, and now allows me to travel probably a little more than I should at times. But I enjoy the best of both worlds.
Yeah. Speak a little bit more about this evangelism. What does that entail? What do you mean by traveling? How does that happen? Maybe an interesting factor too about that, like how much sermons did you preach in 1 week just by traveling? So what does that entail? Because for us, that might be a new concept of just a traveling evangelist.
Yeah.
And how does that even work?
Yeah, we see the roots of that in the book of Acts, as Philip, one of the original deacons there in the church at Jerusalem, we find him in chapter 8 preaching in Samaria.
Yeah.
And the whole city is responding to Philip, and there's joy in the city because of this revival that was taking place there. Well, of course, then later in Acts, God says, I want you to go down to the desert. There's one man, you need to give him the gospel. And Philip goes, leaves the city and goes and wins the Ethiopian eunuch to Christ. Yeah. And then, following that, we see Philip going up the coast of Caesarea and stopping at all these coastal towns preaching. So that's kind of the pattern of the gift of an evangelist. In Ephesians 4, he gave some apostles, some prophets, some evangelists, and some pastors and teachers. So a pastor is called to a particular location, to a particular flock, and ministers to them. The evangelist comes in and is a support to that pastor, and for a week or 2 weeks or whatever the time is designated, comes alongside the pastor and assists him in edifying the church, in helping with evangelism. And so we don't, as evangelists, we don't say, hey, when can you have me come? Churches hear of our ministries and say, we want you to come and hold a week of revival meetings. And that's really the focus, is to get God's people revived so that they can go out and evangelize.
I remember being at a spiritual leadership conference, and they shared your story of your first revival meeting.
Yeah.
That you came to the pastor, and I remember that video vividly in my mind, where the pastor, he's working on the yard there in the church, and you come there and you're like, hey, where's the revival meeting? He's like, we don't have any scheduled.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. The Lord has to teach us some things about who He is and who you are and what that role is. I had an evangelist friend years ago who's now with the Lord, but he used to describe the pastor as the shepherd of the sheep. And he said the evangelist is like the sheepdog. Oh. And he kind of gets the sheep back behind the pastor, right? And I don't know if that's a biblical analogy per se, but I like the analogy that we're there to help the church. We're not there to run the church for a week or take over anything. We don't have any authority in the church other than coming alongside that pastor and being an encouragement through preaching. And like you said, an evangelist does probably more preaching than a pastor would, sometimes multiple times a day. I preach about 800 times a year. Wow. And so in some weeks, I might speak 17 to 20 times. Other weeks it might be just once a day. It would depend on their ministries. Like if they have a Christian school, I might preach in chapel. I've preached in jails and rest homes and all kinds of opportunities. Preached in a cave one time. Wow. Just unique situations where God gives you opportunity to preach.
How do you manage traveling, teaching at the college, and where your heart is in evangelism? How do you manage that and having still that personal time with God? Maybe speak to those people that are in ministry, that are trying to balance all that out. I know your kids are grown already, so you don't have that home responsibility as much, but you still have the college where Pastor Chappell wants you to be there. Sure. And then you're traveling, your heart is to travel, and then all these other responsibilities. How do you balance all that out?
That question gets asked a lot, and I'll answer it this way. It's all one. And I think sometimes we tend to compartmentalize a little too much. And I think our kids pick up on that a little bit. Like, we're going to church now, so let's behave, right? But you don't have to behave at home. And so that same principle kind of exists in my life, in that everything I do is all one thing. And that starts with the relationship with the Lord. Yeah. If you don't have that, you have nothing. You can't lead your family. You can't preach. You can't do anything if you're not in tune with Him. So that's a priority for sure. Your family is always your next priority after the Lord. Because if you lose your family, well, then you really can't tell somebody else how to manage theirs. So that's all one, living for Christ at home and trying to be the right kind of example as a husband, as a father, grandfather. But I look at it all as one. When our kids traveled with us, they never looked at it like our home life and our ministry life. They traveled with us, they were involved in the ministry, they would go out and tell people about Christ with us, or they would go at every service, every night they were in church. That was just their way of life. They didn't look at it any different. And that's kind of the way I look at it now. If I'm counseling a college student one-on-one, that's just as important of a ministry for revival as preaching to 1,000 people. Because like Philip, preaching to a city or preaching to one, it's all part of what God wants you to do. So I don't look at it as like, oh, I need this much time to do this and I got to schedule this. God fits it all together. And yeah, there's sometimes you work all night, to do it, or travel all night or something like that. But it's a joy to serve the Lord. And
you mentioned that you did ministry with your children. I wanted to ask, are any of your children in full-time ministry now?
Yes.
And maybe speak to the young people that might be watching this. How can they hear God's calling to ministry and respond to that?
Yeah. I have 3 boys, and then my daughter, who went home to be with the Lord last year in a car accident. And so she and her husband were in the ministry as well. But my 3 boys are all in the ministry. 2 of my sons are pastors, and one's an evangelist. And so we didn't push our kids toward ministry per se. We wanted them to do what God wanted them to do. As far as the calling of God, it is a call. And God doesn't call every person to ministry. If he did, there would be no one to minister to. So he doesn't call everyone. I've always said, though, every person should be willing to be called. And it starts with an obedient heart. It's like Samuel in the temple, who heard his name being called. And Eli instructed him, when you hear that name again, speak, Lord, for thy servant heareth. And he was teaching the young boy, who was probably elementary age, to have an open heart, to say, Lord, here am I. And I think that's where it has to start. I say this, if the Lord is our shepherd, he gets to choose the path. Yes. And when you're in God's will, there's no such thing as failure. Yeah. If you're out of God's will, there's no such thing as success.
That's true.
You can have all the things the world offers, but Jesus said, what shall it profit a man if he gain the whole world and lose his own soul? Or what shall man give in exchange for a soul? And we might think, well, yeah, that's talking about salvation. But in verse 35, the verse before, he that findeth his life shall lose it. He that loseth his life for my sake in the Gospels, the same shall find it. And the word life and soul are the same word. So God wants our life to be dedicated to him. And when you give your life to the Lord, then he's going to direct you in that perfect will of God for you. I believe God has a general will for all of us. He wants us to be saved. He wants everybody to be saved. He wants us to pray. He wants us to praise him. He wants us to witness. Those are things that are for all of us. He wants us to be pure. This is the will of God, your sanctification. But he also has a specific will. Yeah. And that's something that each individual has to wrestle with, I suppose, with God and say, God, what do you want me to do with my life? Because when we stand before him one day, we're going to stand by ourselves and say, Lord, this is what I did with my life.
So when you say that not everybody is called to ministry, you're not meaning that not everybody's called to serve. We're all called to serve.
Yes.
But when we're talking about ministry, we're talking about full-time ministry,
right,
like a pastor, an evangelist, so full-time ministry.
Yes.
So people should be, especially young people, should ask the question, God, do you want me to be in full-time ministry?
And I think for our children, when they're small, you bring them to church, you get them involved in church. They sing in the choir, or they maybe come and on a work day and they can do things, and they start serving the Lord. They tell their friends about church, or they tell their friends about Jesus. everybody's supposed to do that. Everybody's supposed to put their hand to the plow in that way. As children do that, as young people do that, God's going to say, okay, you're faithful little, now I want to make you faithful in much. And God's going to lead you to a full-time role of what we might call a vocational ministry, where that is what you do. And people say, well, but how do you make money? How do you provide for yourself? How do you supply for yourself? And the Bible has principles there that they that preach the gospel should live of the gospel. And so God allows the ministry to provide for those that serve full time. On the other hand, many of us, myself included, when we started, we had to work on the side. When I was first starting evangelism.
I wanted to ask that, as you were in evangelism, traveling, have you had moments where you were in need or where the finances weren't there? Can you share a little bit about those moments where you didn't expect the ministry, all that you thought it would be, and especially from the financial aspect of it?
Well, I knew when I first started I was going to have to work a part-time job or get a job where I could work whenever I was home. And God provided me an opportunity to work at a dock unloading railroad cars. And of course I was young and I wanted to be in good shape, so but He provided that to put food on the table. But our goal was, that if He would provide in such a way I wouldn't have to do that. But we did that for 2 or 3 years until God filled the schedule. And it's amazing. There were times where my early ministry where I would worry a lot about, God, am I going to be able to provide? Traveling with your family. We were in northern Indiana, broken axle on our trailer. And out in the middle of, nowhere, and of course you're kind of vulnerable to whoever's going to fix it. We got that thing fixed, and by the time we paid the towing and the axle and the labor, $6,000. And I didn't have $6,000. And so I put it on a credit card, which was against my principles, really, but I had no other choice. I had to get to Philadelphia to preach. So we got it fixed, got to the meeting, and I said, Lord, You've created the need. I didn't break the axle. You allowed the axle to break. So You've created the need. And I learned something in those days that when God creates a need, He's responsible to meet the need. And for about 3 months, we carried that credit card debt. And I would, every day, and I would fast and pray, Lord, meet this need. And I had a meeting in South Carolina for a pastor I'd never met. And I decided not to take my family. It was right before Christmas. And I just drove down there by myself, thinking this is probably a little church, and I'll just, do the week and go right back. And he called me and he asked me to do a prayer breakfast for the men. And it was going to mean I was going to drive all night. And I thought, I don't want to sit around and eat donuts and drink orange juice and drive all night to do it, Yeah. I got there were over 600 men at that prayer breakfast. It was a huge church. And we had a wonderful meeting, and people were saved in every service, and God was just working in amazing ways in that church. And at the end of the week, He handed me an offering of $6,000.
Wow.
Exactly what we needed. Do you know that pastor passed away 2 weeks later? I never saw him again. And I thought, that was God. Yep. He allowed that need. He put a meeting on our schedule that He knew was going to meet that need. And a pastor that didn't even know me, who allowed the Lord to lead him, to lead the church, to give. That's just God. I mean, you can't explain it any other way.
Our job is to stay faithful,
Yeah.
and God does the rest.
I always fall back on 1 Thessalonians 5:24. Faithful is He that calleth you, who also will do it.
Yes.
And if God's called you, then He's responsible to do it.
To fulfill that need. As we were talking about full-time ministry, I want to switch gears a little bit and talk about Christian education here. How important is there a need? Do you see a need of Christian education in the church? How important is that for the church, for ministers to have a biblical, solid education? And why is just studying the Bible doing it on your own, kind of not going into like a structured Christian institution to get some biblical knowledge and understanding there.
Sure.
What's the importance of that for a local church?
Yeah. Well, I think all of us have seen in the last decade how secularized education has become in America. And it's really gone from education to indoctrination.
Yeah.
And we see a lot of worldly philosophy. We see a lot of philosophy that is spoiled by the things of the world. And God tells us plainly in Colossians 2 that we're not to allow that to happen to us. Yeah. Don't let those vain philosophies and deceit take over your life. And so I know when I was 18 or 20, I didn't have the discernment on my own to say, how do I sort this all out? I went to public school, and I know that I was influenced to some degree by those teachers and those curriculums. When I got to Bible college, that was a whole different perspective on life and on just how to serve God. So to me, today, 50 years later than when I went to college, you have this completely revamped culture that is anti-God, it's anti-Bible, it's anti-truth. Today, truth has fallen in the street. Yeah. And you can't hardly find the truth. And we don't even trust people who say they're telling us the truth.
Yeah.
So where do you go? Well, you go to the Word of God. We know that's true. And so to go to a Bible college where you can get that foundation for your life, if nothing else, we recommend that young people get a year of just solid Bible training. Get around that philosophy. Let it saturate your mind, your thinking. And then if God's calling you to ministry, of course, a Bible college training provides that theology and those practical methodologies and all the rest that are necessary for ministry. And I know some people say, well, that's a year, 4 years, that's a lot of time, that's a lot of money. Yeah. What do I do with all that? Yeah. What at the end, if I go to school to be a physical therapist, well, I'm going to go help people recover from injury or whatever.
Well, yeah, that's the question is, why do I need it if I'm still going to be like a doctor or a pharmacist somewhere?
Sure. Yeah.
Why isn't just reading the Bible enough at home, doing my personal devotions? Why is that not enough that you recommend that people go to a Christian college?
Yeah. Well, I think we're up against such a strong resistance that we've got to know what we believe, and we've got to be able to defend it. Yes. I was teaching a class yesterday about how do we witness to an atheist? How do we crack through that? They're everywhere. There are people that just don't believe in God. Well, where do we start? They don't believe the Bible. Yeah. So where do you start? How do you... And Bible college, a Christian training like that is going to help you to reach the world for Christ, which is why we're all here. Yeah. And then beyond that, if God leads you into ministry, it's going to equip you in that way. And the need has been great since Jesus said, the harvest truly is plenteous, but the laborers are few. And I share a table in Baptist history class of the number of churches in 1800 and 1850 and 1900. And I ask them, now, what's the trend here in this table? And they get it right away. There's always more churches than there are pastors. And sometimes it's a huge discrepancy. And we see today just churches by the dozens across the country that don't have a pastor. I've been helping a church in the last 3 years. They've been without a pastor for 3 years. Wow. And it's a small congregation. They can't afford to pay someone to come. But we've been going up there, filling the pulpit, trying to encourage them. And they're keeping the doors open. But they need a pastor. Yeah. You think about it, they haven't been able to observe the Lord's Supper for 3 years. Wow. I can't go in there and administrate that. I have no authority as a guest preacher to do it. So those people are missing out on what God has commanded us to do without a pastor. They can't go forward. So the mission fields are begging for people to come. Christian schools, we just can't provide enough teachers. That's true. And there's so many opportunities. I was talking to a young man this week, and he has a church ministries degree, But his sister's teaching a Christian school, and they're begging him to come and be a teacher. He says, Brother Goetsch, I'm not really a teacher. I said, well, but it might be a starting point for you. And they're offering him, a good salary, and they're telling him, if you want to be a preacher, we'll help you to become what your ultimate goal is. But come teach. We need a teacher.
That's true.
So they're our seniors. We have an interview days. Our seniors this year averaged over 10 interviews each.
Wow.
Just people wanting
them to come.
Yeah, wanting them to come. So the need is great.
I want you to address maybe a young person that's listening to this, and he might be encouraged, and he might even ask that question, well, maybe God's calling me to full-time ministry. And then he might approach his parents, and where his parents are going to, not necessarily discourage, but they're going to ask these questions of like, hey, how are you going to support yourself if you go there? What are you going to do after you get that ministry degree? And maybe you need a plan B, or a second option there. Maybe first get a secular education rather than going into ministry or getting a Christian education there. How would you respond to those parents?
Well, as a parent, you want your kids to maybe have as much or more than you did at whatever life stage you're thinking. It took us a while as young adults to be able to afford a home or, just different things in our lives. And you always kind of want your kids to be able to reach that milestone a little sooner than you did, because you know what a joy that is. But, my kids are in the ministry. God's been good to them. We don't maybe see them as much as some parents would. We don't see our grandkids as often as maybe we'd like. But when it's all said and done, we stand before the Lord. Do I want to give an account that I held my kids back from doing what God wanted them to do? Or am I going to say, boy, God multiplied my family through my children to have an impact on the world that is now greater? We have to ask ourselves, why did God give me children? They're a gift from God. Children are an heritage of the Lord. And like Hannah, who gave Samuel back to the Lord, I think every parent should be willing to do that. There's no greater honor than for a child to go to the mission field or go to a place and start a church or even impact children in a Christian school. How can you put a price tag on that? And again, David said, I've been young, now I'm old, but I've never seen the righteous forsaken or seed begging bread. God can take care of our kids, and He does.
Another argument that some parents might bring up is that they send their kids to a secular college or even a secular school, like public schools, when they're younger. And they say, well, our reasoning for that is that they are a light to the world there. Sure. They are supposed to be witnessing to the world. We don't want them to be sheltered in like a private Christian school or even a college, Christian college. So they're saying that student is going to be a light there and a witness for God in that secular world. How would you respond to that, parents? Would you encourage parents to do that, or would there be some caution there?
Well, I appreciate the thought of that. We have to go to the world to reach the world. But I think that's more of a church responsibility to give our kids outlets in a controlled environment. In other words, if we train our children up in the nurture and admonition of the Lord, we're not going to shelter them from being a witness. We're not going to put out their light. We're not going to put it under a bushel. Yeah. We want their salt to be salty, and we want their light to shine brightly. So the church then creates opportunities for our young people to go on a mission trip or to go and maybe do a youth evangelistic outreach or go door knocking in some neighborhoods and tell people about Christ. I think we do have to work a little harder at that because we've taken them out of maybe the public school. Yeah. Again, I've watched this, for 50 years. It sounds really good that my kids are in a public school and they can be a testimony. But when you look at the product of that, it's oftentimes not really there. Whereas a youth group in a church that's dynamic and these kids are, having fun and enjoying life and have a testimony for Christ, that's attractive to bring kids into.
Yeah.
And, we still have plenty of kids around us that we can influence without going to public school. But at the same time, I tell youth pastors all the time, when's the last time you took your kids to a public school football game and we're a light? Let's go. Let's get out there. Yeah. We can produce some opportunities that maybe, like we have public school Bible clubs in all of our high schools in Lancaster. And our teenagers become a part of that. They go in and they minister to these sports teams and they minister after school. So we're able to reach into the public school, and we're seeing kids saved every week through that opportunity.
So that's not just the only outlet, that a public school, that they have to be there for them to be a witness to the world.
Right.
There's other avenues without having to sacrifice the Christian values and education that you can get in a Christian school, where they're, like you said, they're being indoctrinated.
Yeah.
And you have to, for a Christian godly family and parents, they have to work twice as harder to make sure that indoctrination doesn't seep into the heart of that student or that child. And so I think that's...
Your kids, whoever your kids are around, there's the chance that those are going to become friendships and influence.
Yep.
And it's not that we can shelter our kids to the point where they never hear about anything bad. But in a Christian school where the church, the home, and the school are all working together, you have a better chance that that child's going to be protected to some degree, or at least he's going to be accountable in some ways. And then take that child who's growing and maturing and let's go reach the world, through them. I just think I've seen so many young people, and I think of my own life in public school. It's by the grace of God that I came out of a public school without getting involved in drinking and all those other things. But it wasn't so much my Christian training, but I wanted to play sports, so I didn't want to get caught in sin.
That,
right?
yeah.
But again, I certainly could have, because there were times where I wanted to, and I think I just don't want to take that chance with my kids. But I'm not saying they can't be a witness. But I was in a meeting one time in this family. They had two beautiful teenage girls. They were probably about 17, just beautiful girls. And every night they'd bring some guy with them who was worthless. I mean, he just looked worthless. And I said to the dad, I said, man, your daughters have a different boyfriend every night. And he said, we call it evangelistic dating.
Oh, wow.
He said, I let my girls date anybody they want to as long as they bring them to church. And I thought, wow, you're taking a huge gamble. Yeah. I mean, it's noble in its thought, right? But one of those guys is going to latch on to one of those girls, maybe, just win her heart, or maybe by force, and you're going to regret that. Yes. And so there's better ways to do it.
Definitely. Thank you, Dr. Goetsch, for joining us here. And if you're tuning in, you could watch our GLC conference online, and you'll hear Dr. Goetsch preaching there. A good, solid biblical foundation there. And I wanted to ask a couple of closing questions here as we wrap up. First of all, what are some challenges you face in the ministry? Being so long in the ministry as God has called you, and you've been through different stages of just America and the culture around us. And what are some of the challenges that you faced being in ministry? And the second question is, what are some of the greatest blessings you've experienced being in full-time ministry?
Well, I think the challenge is to be faithful. The challenge is to be consistent. We can all get excited at a conference, right? And it's a big deal. And we need those times. But there are some low times. There are some times of discouragement. There are times where you're going through a little bit of a valley. And being able to stay consistent with the Lord, your time with the Lord, your personal walk with the Lord is so important. So that's the big challenge. It's being disciplined in your life to put the right things in every day. I think one of the dangers of the way we think is we think about decisions based on results. And we say, if I do this, I'll have this result. But as finite human beings, we don't know the result. The only person that can live in a utilitarian way is God, because he sees what's going to happen. you and I, when we make decisions, we don't control the consequences of that decision. And so our responsibility is to obey God, to follow Him. Now, I have found in my life that though I can't see the results at the time of the decision, wow, years later, you realize there was a lot more result than you thought. To me, that's what keeps you going. It's that blessing of meeting people. A couple of years ago at Spiritual Leadership Conference, I was walking to a session, and a man kind of caught up, and he said, "Brother Goetsch, you probably don't remember me." And I said, "Well," I'm looking at his name badge. I'm not recognizing the name even, and I said, "Sir, I'm at a loss." He opened his Bible, and he had a picture of me walking down a street with him when he was 8 years old.
Wow.
And he said, "You took me soul winning when I was 8 years old, and we knocked on doors together." I don't remember that, but I'm in the picture, yeah. Right? I said, "Well, what do you do now?" He said, "I'm a pastor." Wow. And those are the kind of things that really keep you going, because I'm not seeing all the fruit right now. Some of it I'll never see this side of heaven. Had a man come up to me and at a meeting, he said, "Do you remember preaching in 1979 at a church in northern Wisconsin?" I said, "Yeah, I remember that meeting. I bought a dog that week." And it was a good dog. I didn't remember the meeting being very good as far as attendance and all that kind of thing. Yeah. And he began to weep. He said, "I got saved that week." Wow. He said, "I'm just an old truck driver." But he said, "I got saved in 1979. This was, 40 years later. Wow. I didn't know that. Yeah. So God gives you those little things along the way that show you that you do what's right, you live based on God's commands and God's prescription for your life. And when you walk that road, you leave the result with the Lord. And the truth is, He does more than we can ask or think.
Yes.
Are there some bumps in the road? Well, sure. But that's true if you're a fireman. That's true if you're a policeman.
Yeah.
And you better be called to whatever you're doing.
Yes.
People say, "Well, I'm not called to preach." Okay, well, what are you called to do?
Yeah.
Because if you're going to be a policeman, you better be called.
Yeah.
That's a dangerous work.
That is.
You better be in God's will. So I would just say to young people, what does God want you to do? Amen. We have lots of ideas about what we want to do. People ask me, "Do you ever miss the farm?" Well, yeah, I could have been a farmer, I guess. I probably would have been happy being a farmer.
Yeah.
But that wasn't God's will. I probably would be in debt up to my eyeballs if I was a farmer. So, I'm thankful that God does know the end from the beginning, and we can trust Him with that. We walk by faith, not by sight.
Thank you, Dr. Goetsch. Thank you for coming here. Thank you.
Pleasure.
We look forward to hearing you at the Godly Living Conference, hearing you speak and preach, and I pray that it'll be a blessed time for everyone. Thank you for joining us. Again, join us for the Godly Living Conference. We look forward to seeing you there.